All right. I think we're all hitting the 1:30 mark. Is the microphone in good? We're here to talk about practical DevSecOps. Who has heard of the term DevSecOps? Real quick, show of hands. So we all are kind of coming with a little bit of familiarity, at least with the term. Just to give some context, my name is Brandon Gillespie. I've been doing tech in a variety of different roles. I've worked on my own programming language, I've done software engineering, I've done systems engineering, I've worked in high secret facilities, I've done public sector, I've kind of seen a lot of the different things. And so that's kind of given me a really interesting perspective on things, which I found useful to talk about topics such as this. And I've even written a book talking about architecture and design and whatnot, and that's what the activator is, if you have a sec to take that out, and we could chat afterwards on it even. Currently, I'm working at a company called Divi. We're a new startup working on changing how credit cards work. If you ever are frustrated with maybe putting in subscription cards and changing your credit cards up on, maybe it's your Amazon subscription or something, we create recurring virtual cards so you can tie it right to a given vendor, and then it will refresh only the amount you want it to refresh, and it will be capped at just however much you say it should be. So that's kind of what Divi's about. You can talk to me about that as well afterwards if you're interested. I think that was not the right button. There we go. Quick show of hands. How many here are developers? Would count themselves as a developer, okay? Hit the right button this time, there we go. Have you been frustrated by your operations team somehow? Right, okay. Why did it do that? The switcher is acting funny on me, sorry guys. Okay, there we go. How many of you guys fall into the system administration category? Probably about half, it looks like, okay. Have you been frustrated by developers? Maybe pushing stuff that, you know. I think that this kind of shows the two sides of the spectrum that you'll see in the technology system, but there is a third side. But just among these two groups, there is an interesting dynamic that you've probably observed. The third group is how many of you are primarily in security? I know there's a few of you because I already talked to you. And when you hear about DevOps, do you kind of want to give up? Does it feel like maybe you're just kind of giving up the keys to the kingdom? Maybe. So the three different groups we have these developers, as we talked about. We have the administrators. And between the two of those, what's going on is you have a little bit of a fox in the henhouse feeling, where the administrators, their primary interest is to make sure the system is up and running and is stable and is functional. And a developer's primary interest is going to be making the software work. And so fundamentally, we're actually at opposed odds when we create this situation, because any change is going to make an unstable system potentially. And so you run into the common challenge that you've probably seen, which is the devs say, well, it worked for me, but I don't know why it doesn't work in production, because you have these isolated environments. So DevOps came around as a way to try and describe how we can mesh these two a little bit better. But they said we're missing a piece, and that's security. And so DevSecOps is about bringing security into the play, as well as the two developers and administrators coming together. So you ask yourself, well, what are these things fundamentally? And DevOps, if I were to distill it down into just a single statement, is about everybody coming together to be responsible for production. Your developers are responsible, as well as your administrators. And if that means the simple way of trying to find out how that works is you put developers on call, so the first phone call goes to a developer, then that's what you do to try and help elevate visibility to that. The second thing is DevSecOps then, and it becomes that everybody's responsible for security. This means that when you hire a network security guy, he's not just being a guard in front of the bank. You hire someone to do network security, and they're part of the team, and everybody else on the team is also responsible for security. In fact, your security people primarily are providing specialty knowledge around security, but they're not just being the guards. They're actually just helping everybody else be part of the security equation. And that's what DevSecOps fundamentally is about, is that everybody is responsible for security. And that can be a problem for some people. I don't know if you can see that or not, but that's basically saying this is a surprise to a lot of people. They like to kind of outsource security and say, I'm not worrying about this one so much. Have you guys ever has anybody here run into that before, where people want security, but they don't want to deal with security? Right? That's a pretty common thing I've seen. With the advent of systems like Heroku and a lot of these infrastructure as services and platform as services systems, you actually come into the world of dev-owned ops, or no-ops, if you've read the book. What is the book on DevOps again? The Phoenix Project. Who's read the Phoenix Project? Probably a good handful of you. That book describes really well, from a story perspective, how to bring DevOps into the play. They don't get as much into the security things, but there is a security guy in the story. Dev-owned ops, a lot of times, the development side will be really frustrated with operations, and so they say, you know what, I can go out and I can just use Heroku, and that solves all of my problems. Now I don't have operations anymore, I'm just using some other service. You have to ask yourself, though, is this kind of the emperor's clothes kicking in here? Because even though you're outsourcing that and you're running it somewhere, you still have business requirements, you still have security requirements, and they're not necessarily going to be doing all of those things for you. Depending on what you're doing, sometimes a dev-owned ops world might be a good solution. Rapid prototyping is a great example of that, where you don't need to get a lot of bureaucracy at play. But I would contend that dev-owned ops is actually quite a bit different from a DevOps or a DevSecOps, because fundamentally somebody else is not going to be doing the security for you. They're not going to be doing all of the operations for you. They're going to have automated systems at play, but if something breaks and you are running one of these, let's say a Heroku type system, and you need to get under the hood and do some forensic analysis, or maybe the database performance isn't where it needs to be, you're kind of limited to some of the functionality as far as the console they've given you, and auditability and these other concerns. So dev-owned ops can become a problem. Fundamentally, DevOps is about respecting that everybody who's a part of this equation, those three actors that we talked about, the developers, the administrators, and the security people, all actually provide value to the equation, to the company. And when they come together and work well together as a team, that's when there's value. And that value happens when you respect each other. And so when the developers and the operations or administrators and the security people can all respect each other, you've actually reached a really good point, a really good place in that organization that you're in. If you find yourself at an adversarial relationship with people, if you find yourself looking at somebody as an object or an obstacle, then you're probably not respecting them, and you're going to have a hard time in the DevOps, DevSecOps world. Fundamentally, the reason people push dev-owned ops is because they want to lower the barrier. They want to make it easier to get those changes out to production, because that's really the business is about the features. It's not about the nitty-gritty compliance requirements. It's not about all the different things that might be interesting to an administrator or a security guy. At the end of the day, all that matters is the product that you're trying to have hosted or run or changed or whatever it is. So you want to lower the barrier and lower the friction and make it easier. And that's really why DevOps and DevSecOps on the side has come in, is because we're trying to just make easier production access. And at the end of the day, these people, if you're a developer, maybe you don't want to know about the security challenges or the platform challenges. You just want to work on the code that you do know and where your comfort zone is. And this becomes the heart of where a lot of the conflict kicks in. So DevSecOps is trying to fix that. And I think that when I've played through these challenges in my experience, they're actually right at the heart of this is a very simple fix, or not even a fix, a very simple way to address this. And in my experience, the key is how you look at it. So the first step is developer access to production. And that can be scary if you say, I'm just going to go give root access to production. Well, that's not something you can make very compliant very easily, because now everybody has this production access and you have really not much auditability. And I'll cover some of the audit level things at the end of this if we have time. I hope we do. But having access to production does actually not mean that you have unlimited access in production. So developer access to production doesn't mean unlimited access. It doesn't have to mean. Another way of wording this, let's talk about it differently. Developers can manage production with tooling and automation, and that does not have to mean that they have ad hoc access to production. They don't have to have the root password or the root account in order to actually get in and administrate the system. You can have tooling that allows them to do the things they need to do, but it's auditable and it brings in the controls that you need, and they still have the access to production to support the DevOps type functionality that's going on. You do this with tooling, as I discussed. And what you're trying to do when you do this tooling is you're trying to answer two questions. Can a single person cause harm? Like if you want to think about missile command and you have the keys to the system and you'd have to have two guys go and twist the key, when it comes down to systems that are really need to be secured, you want to make sure that your tooling makes sure that no one person can slide something in without oversight. So that's going to be code commits. If you're using GitHub or GitLab, you're going to be able to do a second person can authorize access, or not authorize, but review the code and then authorize that that code can go out. So addressing the single person, doing it through change control with automated systems, GitHub, GitLab, that sort of thing, that helps address that. And the more you build infrastructure as code to support that, even your changes to production should go through the same sort of change control. And then the second thing you need to ask yourself is when, not if, when I am compromised, because if you don't think of it as a when, you probably have been compromised already and don't even know it. But when I'm compromised, can I forensically trace what has happened? That means that you have a good enough level of logging, you've got it off the host so that it's now reliable, it's not something that could have been altered, and you're trusting in that information, and you have a good chain of custody and a good audit trail of what's happened. And when you build these two, you build answers to these two questions into all of the systems you build, all of a sudden that access to production through tooling becomes a lot easier. The second part of this that I've found is you do a rotation amongst all your teams. So you got 3 different teams we've talked about. We've talked about the developers, the administrators, and the security people. Well, if you take a step back, and depending on the size of your company, this would vary. Some companies this might work well with, some companies not, but if you take a step back and you say only a subset of those people need to have access to production at any given time, you don't need everybody to always have access to production, maybe you set up a rotation so that a subset of people have the ad hoc access, because you do need to have that. But once you reduce that down in scope, and so you say, you know what, we got a team of maybe 20 or 30 developers, we're going to take 1 or 2 of them, and they're actually going to be in a production rotation, and they're the ones that are going to have ad hoc access. While they're in that rotation, they have separated duties. They actually don't contribute to the regular code base. They're now building and improving that tooling and automation to make everybody else's jobs easier. And you do that through rotation, because who better knows the pain of delivering stuff into production but the developers? And so now they're going to have a vested interest in improving that tooling and making it better while working in this production rotation. Doing these two things, or these set of things, helps to meet compliance requirements. If you actually go through and you have a continuously delivered environment, you can do these things and still hit most compliance systems that I'm aware of. But the first thing you need to do, if you are doing this, is you actually need to understand which requirements you're trying to meet. I was speaking with some gentlemen at lunch, and fortunately for them, they don't have any regulatory requirements making them meet compliance. And that can be a little bit of a tougher situation, because when you're in that boat, you kind of have to choose what level of compliance you want to address. And if your business isn't really vested in being secure, then that becomes even more difficult. And so knowing what your data is, did we just lose the mic? Nope. Knowing what your data is all about understanding the scope of what you want to consider sensitive. So if you're doing PCI, that's going to be credit card numbers. That's your sensitive data. If you're doing SOC, it's going to be something different. If you're doing 1 or 2, you know, it depends on which compliance it is. You're going to have PII, your privately identifiable information, whatever it is you want to consider sensitive. You need to go through and define a scope of what is sensitive. And then you need to really understand where that data is stored, where does it transit, and you want to reduce the scope of that to as small a footprint as possible. That's going to help you with your compliance. And then, once you've got that scope down and you understand where it's at, that's when you start building that tooling so that you don't have to have ad hoc access. Instead, you can use tooling to get people into the systems, and that tooling can now have the audit controls around it that you need to have. Then you ask yourselves the question, do you know right this minute? So think about the systems. How many of you guys host systems or are in charge or responsible for systems in production? Handful of people. Excuse me. Do you know what credible threats face you right this minute? Today, any given time? Do you guys know what that is? Are you confident you know what that is? Like, who's hacking on you right this minute? Anybody feel like raising their hand and telling me? No one dares, right? It's hard to know what the credible threats are. And so ask yourselves these questions. How do I know what the credible threat is to me right now? The harder question is, do you know if your system's vulnerable? And when you're doing this production rotation I talked about, you're going to have developers who are coming in, and they're just interested in their program that they're working on. And so now you're going to have to try and convince them to take a step back and say, we need to look at the system as a whole. And I know you want to focus on the piece you're working on, but now let's try and get focused on a system as a whole and get your head into some of these. And so there's some questions you can ask to help with this. And I found most people, when you go through these sorts of things, they actually are interested, and they become more motivated once they understand the real why behind what's going on. I'm doing a presentation on October 26th on Docker. If you're interested, I'll come back around to that at the end. And some of these questions relate to that, that's why I'm bringing it up now. So I'll try not to talk too much about Docker, but for this first question, do you know what is running on your production systems? Do you know what operating system you're running, what levels of patches you have? Do you know what applications have been installed? Do you know what third-party applications have been installed? Do you know who built it? This is a big question for Docker. If you're pulling repositories off Docker Hub, do you know who built that image that you're pulling? Do you trust them as much as you trust your systems? You know, Docker makes it really easy to deploy these things, but there's a whole slew of public repositories out there, and you don't really know what people are putting into them unless you're building it yourself. Second question is, do you know who has access to those sensitive environments? So now you've spent time scoping your sensitive environments. You know what your sensitive data is that you care about, whatever it happens to be. Who has access to it? Is it just that production rotation, or are there more people who have that kind of admin level access? And the bigger question is, do you have a record of who gave them that access? Do you check on that regularly? Do you see if the lists have changed? Are your configurations secure? A lot of times it's easy to burn configurations straight into config repositories, including database passwords. That's really dangerous. In the container world, the really simple, easy go-to is to put those into environment variables. Well, that's really dangerous because environment variables are a more global thing that can be seen throughout the cluster. I have a tool, if you're interested in that, called Reflex to help with delivering configured secrets at runtime. Cisco is going to cover all of your crypto material, that sort of things. And then is your data secure? Once you store that sensitive data, are you storing it properly? Doing disk encryption for the database, that gets the whole entire database, but anybody who has access to the database still can read the unencrypted data. So are you securing it good enough? You can check the box, or you can actually do it right. There are two different ways of doing this. And then, are your connections secure? How many of you run services in Amazon? Not as many people as I would have thought. The default security groups that Amazon creates allows all outbound access. Of those people who raised your hands, How many of you have actually changed that access policy so that it does not allow any outbound access and you actually control outbound network traffic? One hand, two, I see two hands, okay. Amazon does not recommend doing that because that means you have to get into the network security realm of understanding all your traffic. But once you've done that, especially if you're using a lot of open source software, and I'm a big proponent of open source. I like open source, I contribute to open source, my tool Reflex is open source. These tools dial home for a lot of different reasons, and you don't really know why they're dialing home sometimes. And as soon as you actually go through and cut those outbound connections, you'll be kind of surprised to see how many connections still go out from your systems to do stuff. It's a shocker for most people. And you can do it by just turning on, if you want to run, if you are in Amazon, you can actually turn on your flow logs to get that traffic, or you can run your own NAT and do IP tables logging to get that traffic outbound. So, are your outbound connections allowed? NTP is the other one that's a surprise. A lot of people go, well, we'll just let NTP out because that's time. But NTP is a big common channel for messaging communications when you're maybe being a little more nefarious. And some of you may know this or not, but controlling access to NTP, because NTP is a UDP protocol and there's no real hard requirement on what the payload has to be. So you can kind of send it anywhere. And so if you have this hole allowing NTP out to anything, you've actually just created a hole to send any data you want. And now you can exfiltrate stuff. And then this question is the one that usually gets most people. You have all these things known, you've nailed it on everything you do, but what about the vendors you're using? Are they doing the same things? I think the simplest example is to actually dig into kind of the gaming world a little bit here. If you have ever done any sort of, gaming, let's say you're trying to level up your character, you want to hit level 10, but the only way you can hit level 10 is if everybody in your party is at level 10. And so you might be at level 10, but you can't actually have that achievement granted to you until everybody else in your party is level 10. And if you've got a level 3 guy, well, you're never going to hit level 10 achievement because that level 3 vendor that you're using isn't compliant with SOC or PCI or something else. And so you can go through and say, well, we're going to go do due diligence on this guy anyway, and then that will help us help him. But the reality is there's a lot of pain down that road. And so you want to make sure when you're picking vendors that you're picking vendors who can be strategic for you, that you can also meet the same level of requirements you're trying to meet. And that may mean that you don't get to always pull the easy vendor off the shelf who's doing this already because they made a small startup company that takes care of whatever for you. And you might have to do it in-house. And that can be frustrating for people. And that's a compliance thing. If you don't worry as much about compliance and you're happy letting those vendors, just ask yourself the question, do you trust their security posture? Do you trust what they're doing? This is actually, this slide now, I'm kind of just hitting a few other topics here to help you identify obstacles that you might run into when you're doing DevOps and DevSecOps. How often do you do releases? So we had developers out here. How many of you guys, let's start at the high end of the spectrum. How many of you guys release at least once every year new software, right? That's a pretty easy one, hopefully. Okay, every 6 months, new software release, okay. What about every month you do a new software release, okay? Most of the hands have stayed up. How about every week? Do you do a new release every week? Not quite as many hands. How about every day? Not as many hands, okay. This is what we're getting into is called continuous delivery. Continuous delivery scares people, but it's actually a very powerful and a very secure thing if it's done right. How many of you are familiar with the story of Sisyphus from Greek mythology? A couple of you. Sisyphus was damned to push a boulder up the hill every single day. And he would get to the top of that hill after fighting his way up the hill, and the boulder would roll back down to the bottom, and he would have to start it again the next day. Being in the technology industry, I can empathize with Sisyphus very much because that's what it feels like to do major software releases. That's what it feels like to do patches, is you get this whole entire momentous effort completed, and you're done, and you're thinking, yay, and then it's like, oh, but we got to do it again, and again, and again. And what continuous delivery does, and the reason it makes life so much better, is it says, why push that huge boulder up the hill once a month or once a week? It says, instead, let's break it into small little pebbles, and let's just make it a constant stream that goes up the hill. Anytime someone needs a change, it's done, and it goes into production as soon as possible. And the person who made that change is the one who caretakes it all the way to production. And they usually do it right before they move on to any other task. Now what you've got is the person is aware of the change they're introducing, so if it breaks, they can actually conceptualize it and contextualize it, and they can address the problem right then. Whereas when you're in the 1 month or 1 year or 6 months, whatever, cycle, they've often moved on to 3 or 4 other projects. They've forgotten what it was they worked on. And so if something breaks, they have to dredge it out of their memory. The other thing is that when you're making small changes frequently, you now have less scope of what's going to break when it does break, because it will, and that's okay, because that's how you make it better, so that when that change gets rolled out, it becomes easy to deal with because the scope of it typically is going to be smaller. And as you do this, what's going to happen is as these things break, it's going to improve the overall system. Things are going to get stronger and more resilient, and your whole system, that tooling that I was talking about at the very beginning, allowing developers into production, that tooling is going to improve as you find and work through these things. And so your overall security also improves at the same time, because now you have easier auditable access in production. Everybody's using the tooling. They're not trying to bypass it, because your tooling is what should allow them to go in, this delivery systems. And by having more people use the tooling, delivering stuff more frequently, you're more aware of what's out in production, and you have the opportunity to also patch things more regularly. I'm using a Docker system, and every time we do a deployment, we rebuild the Docker image and we apply all the latest patches. And so every single system we have is going to be currently patched every single time they do a software delivery because of the nature of the system. So you get a lot more security when you build these layers into things. It's all about small increments, doing it frequently. Another obstacle you're going to run into is understanding your pipelines. How do you actually get changes into production? Do you have a staging? Do you have a test environment? What does the development cycle look like? Do you have QA? You know, how do all these different things come together? And if you have a lot of different products, 5 products, 10 products, 300 products, whatever it is, every team's going to have their own pipeline. And so if you're coming from the security side, it's going to be frustrating to try and say, well, I know this team has 4 stages in their pipeline and this one only has 2. And so trying to consolidate these. And then on top of that, how do you do releases? How does that release get through the pipeline? All of these can become challenges to doing DevOps, DevSecOps correctly. The ephemeral state is what I've found. This is, to me, if there ever was a holy grail of system administration in all the years I've worked, we need to stop chasing state. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the configuration management systems that exist today, we've got Salt, Puppet, Chef, Ansible, the works. But every single one of these systems, and I use Salt, and I've used a couple of the others as well, but what they're doing is they're actually chasing an unobtainable goal, and that's that they're chasing state, and you can never reach state. If you think about computing systems, the second we measure something in a computer, it's already out of date, because time is continually moving forward. And config management systems are about saying, I'm going to make the state of that system match what it needs to be. But you can never, ever be 100% correct on that, no matter what system you use, because of drift and everything else. And so what the ephemeral state concept is it says, I'm just going to embrace this whole entire concept. And so what I build and deliver, and this is really where Docker, I'm kind of going off on the side now about containers. This is what those systems are all about, is they're saying, I'm not updating my production systems. I'm going to throw it away and build a new one. And when you start to get your head into that mindset, all of the rest of DevOps and DevSecOps becomes easier. Whether you're using containers or even just building VMs on the fly or whatever it is, the concept of doing things ephemerally and delivering configurations at runtime makes it easier. That's my soapbox for the day, I guess, on that one. Any questions on any of these things? I've kind of run out of my slide deck here. This has kind of just been a brain dump of some of the thoughts I've had around DevSecOps. Does anybody think I've missed anything? Anybody want to add anything? Any questions? Did we hit some of the nails on this one? I don't know. So, yeah, over there. Are you talking, okay, so the question is, how do you do data integrity in a production environment when the business side needs data integrity, but not the development side? Is that what you said? Now, by data integrity, you're talking about like protecting from alteration, or are you talking about just having people get access to the data? That one becomes a software architecture question. So making sure the data is correct, accurate, and total. That's more of a software architecture thing, I would think. And I have thoughts, and I could bounce them around. Come up afterwards, let's talk, for sure. Any other questions? Yeah. Right. So the question is, how do you make sure that vulnerability testing is happening as part of the CI/CD pipeline? Okay. What we're doing, and I think everybody's going to implement this one probably their own way, but what we're doing where I'm at right now is when you do a merge request or a pull request, depending on the system you're using, that will kick in what we're doing for vulnerability testing, and that generates a container, and then you can actually launch that container and you can do your testing against it even before the code gets merged. I'm a big proponent of containers, by the way, in case you haven't noticed. Those sorts of things become easy once you're in that sort of ecosystem, because you can do all of that. You can bring it up, you can have a temporary database, you can drive your QA software against it, you can do your vulnerability scans against it, and that all happens before the code even gets merged as part of the merge process and code review process. That's how I'm doing it. Does anybody else do it differently? What would anybody else have any thoughts on answering that question? Because that just happens to be my way. No other thoughts? Does that help with your question? There was, yeah, back there. Right. Right, so the recommendation is to also use GitHub and GitLab have hooks for having second-party review of code, where you have a different group that would come in and review that code. That would be another way of also doing that. We're actually doing both of those where I'm at right now. We do code review and the automated. Anybody else on that topic? Now, there was another hand I saw go up at the same time as yours. I think it was in this vicinity. Did anybody have a different question? Yeah. What do you do if your compliance teams do not understand DevOps? Anybody have any ideas on that one? How do you help elevate visibility to the value of DevOps? Because that's going to be a cultural thing. I mean, DevOps is very much a cultural change. It's about getting the idea of bringing people together, and it's about tearing down walls. I think if you were to talk DevOps at large, I had a CTO approach me and say he wanted to create, he liked this idea of DevOps, and he wanted to create a DevOps team, wanted to know if I could help out in creating this team. And it said, you don't understand DevOps if that's the request, because you shouldn't have a DevOps team, in my opinion. Everybody can have different opinions. But if you're doing a dedicated team for DevOps, then you've kind of missed the boat, because DevOps is about lowering the barriers. And if you're creating another team, then all you're doing is changing the name of a system administrator and an automation guy. And you still have these barriers between people. And so the idea is to kind of merge people together, and if it means bringing them onto the teams and like doing stand-ups together and like breaking apart the silos, that's kind of what DevOps is about. How you do it really will largely depend on the organization you're in. You can have a DevOps team. I'm not saying like that would be verboten or something. How you do it will largely change how effective you're going to be within the organization. And you can even have people with the title DevOps administrator. I've seen that as well. I think that it just depends on your organization. I've tried to shy away from those titles in the groups that I've been with because I feel like if we're trying to make a cultural shift, we got to really get people's heads into it. And that's, I think, the start, for sure. Other thoughts, questions? Hands? All right. So to wrap it up, DevSecOps is possible, DevOps is possible, even in a compliant environment. If you're interested or have any other questions, feel free to come up and talk to me. I'm actually, I'll stick around for a little while and chat with everybody. And just so you know, I put together this book here. It talks about, it's the activator. It's talking about how to do architecture and design thinking and technology and the challenges. I have a lot of stories and examples that are in there through my career of the different places I've worked that kind of make it interesting. I'm working on a book right now on doing Docker and it's the practical approach to using Docker, and I've got security, and it's a hands-on, it's not just a reference book. That will be coming out soon. And there also, if you're interested, there is a seminar I'm putting on, thanks to Cadence Security is hosting it. And not security, Cadence, I don't know what you guys call yourself, Jonathan. That'll work. Cadence is hosting it. It's going to be October 26th. If you want to go to that, it's open to the public and it counts for 1 CPE. So thanks for everybody for coming out. Appreciate your help. Appreciate you chatting.